So Amanda, should I go? Should I go, Amanda? Okay. Hello and welcome to the live stream format of the Spring 2020 Métis Talks. My name is Nathalie Kermoal. I'm the director of the Rupertsland Center for Métis Research and also a professor at the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. So this is the first time that we're doing something like this, I'll ask you to be patient with me and also with us in general. So today, our Métis Talks, there are people that are, that the speakers that we have are not at the University of Alberta. So I'm going to do the land acknowledgements for each and every places where people are from. So we're going to start with the University of Alberta that is located on Treaty 6 territory, traditional gathering place for Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. And one of our speakers, Tricia, Logan, is situated on at the University of British Columbia's main Vancouver campus. And that campus is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. These lands have always been a place of learning for Musqueam youth who were instructed in their culture, history, and tradition, and who in turn shared their knowledge with the new generation. And then our other speaker, Gregory Scofield, is situated at the University of Victoria on the traditional, and the University of Victoria is situated on the traditional territory of the Songhees, Eskimo, Sanish peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So some of you may have heard of the Rupertsland Center for Métis Research, while others that are listening to us across the Métis homeland may not have heard of the Rupertsland Center for Métis Research. So the Rupertsland Center for Métis Research, or RCMR as it's usually known, is a joint venture between the Métis Nation of Alberta, the Rupertsland Institute for Métis Excellence, the Faculty of Native Studies, and the University of Alberta. It's housed in the Faculty of Native Studies. And it's an academic research program specifically geared towards Métis issues and topics. The goals and objectives of the research center include building provincial and national connections with the Métis community, increasing research capacity to advance Métis-specific research, and training and employing student researchers. So we have a number of events. We've organized conferences, we write research reports, but we're also do the Métis Talks, which are a semi-annual public event in the fall and spring that highlight Métis-specific research, art, and culture. So our session today and theme has grown from the Legacy of Hope Foundation exhibit entitled Forgotten, the Métis Residential School Experience. In March, we had the pleasure of hosting the exhibit on the North Campus at the University of Alberta. And the hosting of the exhibit was a joint effort between the University of Alberta Libraries, the Vice Provost Indigenous Programming and Research, and more specifically, Dr. Florence Glenfield, and the Rupertsland Center for Métis Research. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, we had to cancel the in-person session. So we had, like organized, we were thinking of organizing something in person with Greg and Tricia, but unfortunately we had to cancel that. And so we were very sad and disappointed. But after talking, we decided that maybe an online session would be a good thing. Considering that it's online, it's a bit shorter, as we know that watching a screen is not exactly the same as listening to a person in a room. So there might be, we're hoping that the live stream is going to be fine, and that the ancestors are going to, keep us safe when it comes to the live stream, and that it won't break away. But we never know with technology. So if that happens, I just want to reassure everybody that we'll continue to record the video, and then what we would do is we would upload it after the presentations to the Facebook, to our Facebook page or to our website. And also, we are going to take questions after each and every one of the speakers. So there's going to be 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A session. We ask you to please tell us your name, where you are from, and write any questions in the live stream chat. So what will happen then is, like, the questions are taken by Jordan Cook, who's our communication person at the Faculty of Native Studies, and Leah Hertzon, who is a graduate student at the Faculty of Native Studies, are going to take those questions. They're going to send them to Amanda Evans, who's the coordinator of the Rupertsland Center for Métis Research, and she will be the one asking the questions to Gregory and Tricia. So today we're going to start with Gregory Scofield. Gregory is Métis of Cree, Scottish, and European immigrant descent, whose ancestry can be traced to the Métis community of Kenosota, Manitoba, and to Bacon Ridge, a former Métis road allowance community that is now part of Ebb and Flow First Nation. He has taught creative writing and First Nations and Métis literature at Laurentian University, Brandon University, Emily Carr University of Art and Design, and the Alberta University of the Arts. He currently holds the position of Associate Professor in the Department of Writing at the University of Victoria. Gregory won the Dorothy Lovely Poetry Prize in 1994 for his debut collection, The Gathering, Stones for the Medicine Wheel, and has since published 7 further volumes of poetry, including Witness I Am. He is also the recipient of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2012, and most recently, the Writers' Trust of Canada Latner Poetry Prize in 2016 that is awarded to a mid-career poet in recognition of a remarkable body of work. Gregory's first memoir, Thunder Through My Veins, was republished in the fall 2019. Further to writing and teaching, Gregory is also a skilled bead worker, and I have to say I've seen some of his work and I'm in awe every time. And he creates in the medium of traditional Métis arts. He continues to assemble a collection of mid to late 19th century Cree Métis artifacts, which are used as learning and teaching pieces. So the title of Gregory's presentation today is Our Grandmother's Hands, Repatriating Métis Material Art. Gregory, your turn.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nathalie. That was a wonderful introduction. Uh, Hello, and I hope you are all well out there. This is the first time that I've been in this room behind me for a Zoom call. So, like everybody else, I'm getting used to this whole new medium of going online. I mean, of course, I'm used to being in the classroom and I'm used to seeing everybody face to face. So this is a bit of a different format, but I hope it will be a good one today anyway. So just before I begin, I'm sending my best wishes to everybody. I hope you're all well. I hope that given the situation that you're all thriving, you're finding things to do and you're keeping busy. So danse and good afternoon. I would first of all like to thank the Rupertsland Institute for this invitation. I was very excited to receive this invitation and to be able to share my talk today. So the talk that I'm going to give today is called Our Grandmother's Hands, Repatriating Métis Material Art. I was actually going to use the title Repatriating Métis Material Art one piece at a time, because that's literally how I've been repatriating pieces, is that I seem to be finding one piece at a time, and if I'm able, I try to bring them home. And I'll talk a little bit more about that idea of home in a second. So this idea of repatriating art, this actually came about from my lifelong interest in history and antiques, and more recently, the realization that much of our Métis material art, much of our specific Métis material art in museum collections across this country has and continues to be misidentified. Oftentimes, our material art, which is including beadwork, silkwork, quillwork, to name a few, oftentimes our pieces are folded into other First Nations cultural groups, or also into displays on Victoriana. I'm just going to turn my notes here, if you don't mind. So before I begin talking more about the misidentification of a lot of our pieces in museum collections, I'd like to tell you two quick stories, and I'm giving you a really kind of condensed version of why I've been collecting today. We have a limited amount of time, but I want to try to pack as much into my talk as I can. So I'd like to tell you two quick stories. So when I was 8, my late mother, Dorothy Scofield, took me to a small museum in a place called Fort Langley, British Columbia. We were living in just across the river in the town where I was born, which is called Maple Ridge, BC. So when I was 8, she took me to visit the fort. There's an actual Hudson's Bay Company fort in Fort Langley, and there's also a small museum. So while we were in the museum, I remember being really enthralled at the displays, and especially poring over the local Coast Salish displays. So a lot of the material art of the local First Nations in British Columbia, specifically in the Lower Mainland. At some point, I guess while we were at the museum, the curator must have seen my keen interest or observed it, and he asked my mom if he could show me the special collections in a back room of the museum. She agreed, and I followed him to this back room, and he proceeded to show me this incredible collection of stone tools, cedar bark weaving, some carvings, and some various other pieces that were reflective of the Coast Salish people. before I left, he gave me, and it's, kind of interesting thinking about this now, before I left, he gave me this very old stone pestle that had been broken. I guess it was a piece that he felt that they could, that would be okay if he gave it away. And I remember, of course, being given this piece and being so happy to get this piece, and, looking at it, and on the bottom there was, an engraved identification number. And I remember taking this piece home, and I was so overjoyed by it, and I displayed it front and center. I was one of those kids that was always making things. I was making replicas. I was doing all kinds of things. And, my stone pestle, my new pestle, really sat front and center of, these little things that I was making. It was after that day that I was really bitten by what I call the museum bug. And, I began kind of curating every little piece that I found at antique or thrift stores. So, of course, growing up for me, we were often, going to the Sally Ann, and, I sometimes would find little old pieces, and I would, if I could, depending on my allowance, I would buy them, bring them home, and, I would give them a special number and, display them where I could. So the other story I want to tell you is about 5 years ago, I was invited to give a poetry reading at the Victoria Writers Festival here. This was before I moved home. And while I was in town, I visited probably one of the most beautiful museums that I've ever seen, which is the Royal British Columbia Museum in Victoria here. So Royal British Columbia Museum has an extensive and really mind-boggling collection that is reflective of the history and art of British Columbia's coastal First Nations. So like most museums too, they have an extensive collection that is reflective of settler history and of the history of that particular province and how that came about. So I remember as I made my way throughout the museum and being so completely blown away by all of these beautiful displays, I stopped at a small display that was showcasing Victoriana women's sewing, needle, and lace work. So as a centerpiece to this display was a very small black velvet beaded pocket watch holder. And it was very similar. I'm going to hold up a piece here of a piece that I was able to find. This is one of the first pieces that I was able to repatriate home. I believe this came from an auction someplace in the States. And this is actually a very old pocket watch holder. It dates to probably about 1870, 1880. Although it's very hard to see, the beads are extremely, extremely tiny. And I'm just looking at myself in my reflection here and realizing I should be wearing probably latex gloves as I'm holding these pieces. But, I really wanted for you to be able to look at the exquisite work on this pocket watch holder. So this is done on black velvet, and the back is lined, or it is done with a very old, it almost looks like an oilcloth of some sort. So there was a very similar watch pocket holder in this display of Victoriana women's work. So of course, I immediately identified that it was not Victorian, but rather it was Métis, and that it also, dated to probably about 1870, 1880, and that it was Métis, and that it was likely from the Western subarctic. or also known as the kind of Northwest Territories. So Cree, Dene, and Métis watch pockets, such as the one I just showed you, were fairly common tourist items that were made in the late 18th or the late 19th century. So I remember looking at the exquisite work on the watch pocket, aware that it was surrounded by Victorian women's sewing implements. I wanted to reach in and I wanted to take it, to literally take it, and to put it with other beautiful examples of Cree Métis art. For me, it was like seeing a grandmother. It was like seeing one of our grandmothers smack dab in the middle of all of this Victoriana work and being folded into this work and being really completely misrepresented and misidentified. So of course, I wanted to reach in and I wanted to take this beautiful pocket watch holder and I wanted to put it with a display of Cree Métis pieces with a specific geographical history and perhaps even with family history if we could find it. But like most pieces, this particular watch pocket holder sat there and it was completely misidentified. I realized upon that visit that this was really a common experience, I think, for a lot of Métis people visiting museums and looking for pieces, for our own specific pieces in collections, only to realize that a lot of our pieces were being folded into other First Nations material art, therefore being misidentified. So the experience that I had at the Royal British Columbia Museum really 5 years ago really furthered my resolve to continue finding and repatriating the best that I can and to my ability to finding and repatriating Métis material art. Up to this point, I had already found a sizable collection and finding pieces as far away as the United Kingdom. There's a number of pieces in the collection that have come from the United Kingdom. In fact, behind me, I don't think you can probably really see the full bag, but there is an octopus bag that dates to 1840 that is hanging on the wall. I'm going to try to adjust my computer. There we go, just a little bit. So you can see, it's actually behind the jacket. So there is an 1840, 1850 octopus bag that was actually found in the UK. And the seller that I purchased this bag from, when I asked her if she had any provenance that went with the bag, she told me that she had bought it from a seller in the UK and that the seller had a number of Victoriana pieces. And this was one of the pieces in that collection. And the seller that she had bought it from felt that this was a very, very clumsily rendered piece of Victoriana, and she really just wanted to get rid of it. So, once again, there were our pieces, or there are our pieces, sitting in collections and, private collections in the UK and all over the world that are being misidentified and, of course, not appreciated. So, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I began this repatriation process roughly about 10 years ago. I would find pieces on eBay, or I would find them on auction sites really all over the world. I found pieces, as I mentioned, in the United Kingdom. I found pieces in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, in really all across the States. So I would find pieces on eBay or auction sites, and I would try to bring them home when I could. A lot of these original pieces that I originally found about 10 years ago ended up in the collection of the Gabriel Dumont Institute in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I've had the great fortune over a number of years to work with the Gabriel Dumont Institute on resource guides on traditional floral Métis beadwork, on traditional Northern style Métis moccasins. We've actually just worked on a resource guide on traditional Métis bags. So I've done a lot of work with the Gabriel Dumont Institute in the past. I've helped in curating the museum that they have, and also helped them in finding some pieces. So originally, a lot of the pieces ended up going to the Gabriel Dumont Institute. And my idea is that as I would find pieces, and I wasn't necessarily on purpose looking for them, but as I would find pieces, I would try to get them. And I really wanted for these pieces to be back in Métis hands, and I wanted them to be back in our homelands. I wanted them home. I wanted them home to Canada, and I really wanted them to come home to us. In fact, each piece that I find, I almost see them as if they've been children who have been adopted out from our communities. And I really try my absolute best to bring them home. They need to be home. They need to be in our institutions. They need to be available for our community. These pieces, of course, reflect our unique history and our unique art and culture. But above all, they reflect our grandmothers who, during a dark time in our history, so really during a time after about 1870 onward, who during that time of disenfranchisement for many Western Canadian Métis, our grandmothers were the ones who were busy sewing to support their families. Their work, their pieces of beadwork, their pieces of silk work, of course, carry their stories, they carry their laughter, they carry their histories, they carry their tears, their hopes, and really their survival. When there were few opportunities for the Métis in the mid to late 19th century, it was really women in our communities that were working to keep their families fed, that were working to bring in what little money they could. So in the mid to late 19th century, the women, and this is for an example, the Cree Métis women of Norway House, Manitoba, became world famous for their breathtaking silk work. And I want to show you a few pieces of the work that was being done for the tourist trade in Norway House. I want to show you, this is a pair of pointed toe silk embroidered. I'm going to try to bring the embroidery up as close as possible. So this is a pair of pointed toe moccasins made of moose hide and of caribou hide with features silk embroidery work. So these moccasins date to about 1870, 1880, and you can see the exquisite work that was done on them. And the piping that you see kind of around the edges, this is all dyed horsehair that has been wrapped around horsehair and has been sewn around the back. So pieces such as these moccasins, pieces such as, pieces such as this folding purse, this bag, you can see a very kind of similar silk work that was being done in Norway House. So there's this bag. I have another example of a bag that was done. So you can see a very similar style of silk work that the women in Norway House were doing. And this is completely unique to Norway House, Manitoba. There's one more example of a bag. And this is done on smoked caribou hide. This bag probably dates to about 1900 to 1910. So this piece here is, this is a hanky holder. So I don't know if you can see, but you put your hankies in here. The last couple of pieces I want to show you is that these are napkin rings. So you can see the amount of work that went into these. I'm just going to show you this here. So the work from Norway House, the work that the women were doing, of course, became world famous. And buyers would oftentimes go into communities. So they would go to communities like Norway House, and they would acquire the best work that they could possibly find. They would take the work that they purchased and they would sell it to other buyers who in turn would sell it to regular clients, or they would sell it to tourists. A lot of the pieces that were being done in Norway House toward the end of the 19th century were pieces that were being done for the tourist trade. So when you think of things like napkin rings, these were probably the souvenirs, the tourist souvenirs of the day. So of course, these are all very Victoriana focused. You know, this probably was bought and purchased for a fine Victorian lady to keep her hankies in. So such things as bags, purses, pocket watch holders, handkerchief holders. I also have, there's a man's tie here. So all of these things, of course, would have appealed to a Victorian audience and to a Victorian clientele. So these pieces really ended up all over the world. And these are some of the pieces that, that I'm trying to bring home. Just kind of an end note on the Norway House pieces. This is a collection that I would love to one day, in collaboration with Norway House community, I would one day love to do an exhibit that highlights the historical work that was being done in Norway House. So this is just, I'm going to wrap up my talk. I could probably spend the entire afternoon talking and you know, doing a show and tell for everybody. This is just a very kind of small example of, you know, even the pieces behind me. This is a very small example of the pieces in the collection. All of the pieces in the collection date between 1840 and 1920, and all are reflective of our unique Western Canadian Cree Métis art forms and aesthetics. So I wish that we had the time of where I could give you a tour of all of the collection, and you know, hopefully one day I'll be able to do that. I'm often asked about what I want to eventually see with the collection. One thing is certain, and I made up my mind about this quite a while ago. One thing is certain is that I never want to see these pieces on the open market again. I don't want them to be out there. My hope is that the collection will one day end up with one of our cultural institutions, one of our cultural organizations, and that they will be made accessible to our historians, our audiences, or our artists, our scholars, and those who are wanting to learn about our culture and our history. So in the meantime, when I can, I'm searching far and wide for our material art. Each piece that I find, when it arrives, it goes through a ceremony. I won't talk too much about that ceremony, but I will tell you that part of that ceremony is not only honoring the pieces themselves and the pieces coming home, but of course honoring the grandmothers that made those pieces and honoring the work that they've done and telling them that their work is safe and that their work is appreciated and that their work will be honored. I want to leave a legacy really for another young Métis boy or girl whose mother maybe one day takes them to a museum. I want for them to be able to stand in front of these pieces, and I want them to feel an incredible sense of pride in who they are. I want them to be able to look at our material history, and I want them to be able to see themselves within those pieces. And of course, I want for our scholars, I want for our artists to be able to have access to them. I feel very fortunate and honored. I mean, I almost don't have the words to express it, but I feel very, very fortunate that I've been able to not only find the pieces that I've been able to find, but that I've been able to, I always talk about this idea of bringing them home. So I feel so fortunate that I've been able to do that. And I really look forward to the day of where these pieces will be accessible to people in our community. Again, I do a lot of work with the Gabriel Dumont Institute in Saskatchewan. We're talking about possibly adding a lot of the pieces to their virtual museum. If you haven't seen the virtual museum on the Gabriel Dumont Institute website, I suggest that you take a look at some of their beautiful pieces. So we're talking about possibly adding these pieces to their virtual museum, and possibly at some point maybe doing a book featuring a lot of these pieces. Until we have kind of a space for these pieces to be exhibited, I want to try to find the best possible way that these pieces will be made accessible. So with that, once again, thank you to the Rupertsland Center for the invitation today. Tricia, I look very forward to your presentation, and thank you all for tuning in, and keep well, keep safe, and
Thank you very much, Gregory. I've been admiring the pieces that are behind you. They're amazing. And all the ones that you showed us today, this is an amazing collection. So we're going to go for a Q&A session now, 5-10 minutes, depending if there's questions or, and most of the questions are going to be relayed to Amanda, and Amanda will ask them. But maybe I can start with one question, because you mentioned the fact that, like you look at auctions and, to try to find some of these pieces. Are you able, when you participate in those auctions, or are you able to get a sense of how those pieces were, I don't know if a collector got them how they managed to get them, or like, are you able to retrace that history? Because it's in itself, it's interesting to try to maybe see, you know, the mobility, if I may use that term, of those pieces of art, and because it can be telling of a lot of things. So I was just curious about that.
That's a great question. I always ask sellers where they found the pieces and where they've come from. And oftentimes, which is really most of the time, sellers have no idea. In fact, a lot of the times the pieces that will be listed, or the pieces in their listing identification, the pieces will be listed as, you know, Iroquois. They'll be listed as Sioux. They'll be listed as anything but Cree Métis. So oftentimes these pieces end up, you know, in sellers' hands because they've, you know, bought pieces from the States. You know, families have gotten rid of things, and you know, I think a lot of non-Indigenous collectors were really kind of not too concerned about, you know, maybe kind of the geography or even the nation specifics of certain pieces. And so, you know, that's one of the things that's really inspired me with this collection, is that, you know, as I'm finding all of these misidentified pieces, you know, I look at them and I go, you're coming home, you're coming home. And, you know, I know what you are, you're coming home. And, you know, I've been very fortunate because, of course, I, you know, in kind of a constant conversation with an amazing scholar out of the University of Regina, Sherry Farrell-Reset, who, you know, Sherry is also very familiar with Métis material art. So Sherry and I are in constant kind of conversation about, you know, where do you think this piece comes from? You know, what do you think the date is? You know, what have you. So, you know, that's all of this process of bringing pieces home, is to be able to give them back their histories, to be able to give them back their geographies. So, you know, I try to get as much information as I possibly can, but the unfortunate thing is that the majority of the time, you know, these pieces are coming out of the bottom of a box, and, you know, people just want to get rid of them.
Thank you. Do we have any questions, Amanda?
Yes, we do have a couple of questions. Lauren Burgess asks, or says that he's curious about the repatriation process. He had a chance to hear Robin R.R. Gray from BC discuss repatriating Indigenous music from the archives at Columbia at the OLA Copyright Symposium last year. So he's wondering if you have any comments on the repatriation process.
Well, I think that the repatriation process is extremely important. There was actually Chief Crowfoot, who is, I believe he's Siksika from Alberta. Some pieces that belonged to Crowfoot, I believe it was a shirt, and I believe there was some other items in that collection, were being held by a museum, and I forgot what museum it was in the United Kingdom. But of course, the community, Siksika, that particular community, had been in conversation with the museum for a number of years about being able to repatriate Crowfoot's pieces back to the community. And of course, a lot of museums have been very kind of resistant to this idea about, you know, giving back, you know, pieces to the community. And while, you know, there are some, you know, legitimate concerns about, you know, the housing of these pieces, you know, this, you know, museum kind of quality conditions of, you know, where these pieces are going to be housed, I think that, more and more, because museums historically, especially non-Indigenous museums, have been, kind of these places, these institutions of where a lot of our culture and a lot of our history as Indigenous people, where a lot of those pieces were acquired through, anthropologists, through, linguists, through various people going into communities and literally taking things, stealing things, and, these things ending up in museum collections. So, I think museums really across the world are really trying to think about how and what this idea of repatriation means. And for me, in the work that I'm doing, this work is, I don't see this as a private collection. This is a collection for our community. This is a collection for, our scholars, our historians. And really it's about, as I said earlier, about giving the history and the stories back to these pieces, because I think that's what's missing a lot in museum collections, is that the stories are missing from those pieces, the purpose is missing from those pieces, and that a lot of those pieces are just being displayed as, these kind of archival things that are without spirit. So, I think really to kind of sum up my answer, I think that people are still trying to figure out this idea of what repatriation means.
Great. Our next question is from Albert McLeod, and he's wondering about the caring of the pieces, and if embroidery that's this old, if you should keep it out of direct sunlight, or how do you care for these pieces?
Yeah, the pieces are, I have a lot of the pieces housed in this room here. There are special blinds. The sun is really never allowed in this room. The temperature is kept quite low in this room. And a lot of the pieces are kept in acid-free tissue paper, and they are put away. Of course, embroidery is very susceptible, especially the old silk embroidery threads are very susceptible to fading. And so sunlight, things like that are very, very dangerous for a lot of these pieces. So, I'm obviously, I'm not set up as a museum, but from everything that I've read, everything that I've studied, I try to do my best to make sure that the pieces are kept in a really safe way.
Next, we have Gregory John Fink, who says, fantastic effort to gather the pieces of the past. For pieces located overseas, overseas museums with collectors outside of Canada, how difficult is it to figure out where the work was originally done? Are there specific patterns that are obvious versus those that are selected for commercial desire?
Right. Again, a really wonderful question, because a lot of the pieces, and I'm gonna push my computer up again so you can look at the octopus bag on the wall. So a lot of these pieces, the design aesthetic and also the composition and the materials used in these pieces, I mean, I could probably spend 3 hours just talking about octopus bags, but these pieces, like the one on the wall behind you and the one actually on the jacket right here, these pieces are very indicative and very reflective of Western Canadian Cree Métis beadwork. So it follows a very kind of classic design style. So if you're able to see on the octopus bags, you'll see a centralized flower. You'll see this very kind of symmetrical on this mirrored image on either side. And a lot of the materials that were being used in octopus bags during the 1840s through to about the 1880s. A lot of those materials were, things like black wool stroud, very small, tiny seed beads, wool yarn, old kind of lining fabrics. So there is, there's been a number of reference books that have been published on specific kind of Cree Métis pieces. And there's one particular book, I should have pulled it out for you to look at, but one particular book, I believe, called Out of the North. And this book was put together by a curator from the museum. Now, it's one of a few books that I have, and it talks specifically about design elements, design aesthetics, geography. So the pieces that I've tried to find for the collection are very reflective, specifically of Western Canadian Cree Métis history.
Okay, and second last question. It asks, from Tanya Harnett asks, do you have a database or a website where folks may see works you have collected?
That's something that I'm working on, and that is something that, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that's a project that I'm hoping to possibly embark on with the Gabriel Dumont Institute. So I would love to be able to document a lot of the pieces, to be able to provide the history about those pieces, dates, the materials that have gone into their construction. So this is something that is in the works, and this is something that I hope to do within the next little while. I've been trying to share as many pieces as possible on social media, on Facebook. I know it's not the same of being able to kind of go to a website and see pieces, and of course it's not the same of being able to physically go into a space and to be able to open drawers and pull back the acid-free tissue paper and look at pieces and oogle and awe them. So until that time, I'm trying to find ways, in the best possible ways, to make the pieces available.
All right, and the final one is from Aubrey Watson, and I think that she reflects a lot of how we're all feeling. She says, "Hi, Gregory, more of a comment. Thank you for sharing these lost pieces as children being adopted out. You are trying your best to bring them home. Such a great analogy, and how colonization has affected every layer of how people identify themselves. I am Ojibwe/Juanita myself, and I don't think I've thought about artwork in that way before. Hi, thank you for sharing."
Oh, thank you. Kanaskumten.
So thank you very much, Gregory, for this and for this amazing talk, and also for showing the art that you have collected through the years. It's an amazing collection, and we wish the collection and yourself good health and a lot of good things for the future. So we're going to move to our next speaker, Tricia Logan. Tricia is the head of research and engagement at the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Tricia is a Métis scholar with more than 18 years of experience working with Indigenous communities in Canada. She has held roles at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and the Legacy of Hope Foundation. She completed a PhD in history at Royal Holloway, University of London. Tricia has worked with survivors of residential schools, completed research on the Métis experience in residential schools, and worked with Métis communities on language revitalization. So the title of Tricia's presentation today is Métis Experiences and Histories at Residential Schools.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. For anyone who wants to point out the humor in my stark blank wall behind me instead of very beautiful art and beadwork and embroidery, I instead have chosen blank white wall. And it's my feeling of having and following Greg, which is a daunting task, but I took some of my inspiration from Greg, as we all do as Métis scholars. So I'm going to carry on from what Greg said as well, and share a little bit about my own family and how it's connected to some beadwork and work that my grandmother did. So I'm just taking a cue from Greg, as we all do from time to time. I'm going to share my screen because I created a PowerPoint, so you don't have to stare at my face and a blank wall. I'll start sharing my screen a bit because it's easier to watch that way. So yes, I'm Tricia Logan. I work here at the Residential School History and Dialogue Center at UBC. I'm also cross-appointed in the School of Information, the iSchool Library and Archive Studies here at UBC. I've been working with survivors of residential school for a long time, and histories and stories of residential schools, in particular Métis experiences at residential school, for a long time. I started in 2000, and I have to give credit to my, at the time, the wonderful Leah LaPlante, who works at the Southwest Region Manitoba Métis Federation, who hired me as a BA, I had a BA in Native Studies and was working at a rib restaurant because that was what happened in the year 2000. But Leah created an Aboriginal Healing Foundation project on Métis experiences, asking the question of what were Métis experiences like at residential school. And my family, having gone to the Capel Residential School in Alberta, Saskatchewan, I knew personally about what had happened to Métis people in residential school. At the time I was writing papers in university. I had professors, that was early 2000, 2001. And at the time I had scholars and professors and writers say, no, you won't find anything. Métis people didn't go to big residential schools. They were for First Nations and Inuit only. You're not going to find anything. But knowing that my own family, by all cultural, legal definitions, economic, social definitions of Métis, attended a residential school, I knew that wasn't the case. And so had worked a little bit to interview some Métis people and survivors and historians, elders, and do a lot of archival research to kind of explore a bit of what Métis experiences were, and that's work that I'm still carrying on today. And so I'm sharing a piece of beadwork that is a terrible picture I took behind glass, because again, not an artist, not a great photographer. My dad, that's a piece that my great-grandmother did. My great-grandmother's in the photo to the left, right, I don't know what way people are seeing that. That's from the Capel Residential School. And that's also a story. I often tell the story. I don't always share these photos, and I rarely share the photo of my grandmother's beadwork. But it was, my great-grandmother is in the photo. There are no photos of the time that my grandmother was in residential school, which is of course a bigger story about records and archives and access to archives and records of residential school in general. But my great-grandmother and grandmother both went to the same school, and this was beadwork that my great-grandmother had done, and my grandmother and my family had kind of hidden it away for a long time, like a lot of families do, and not talk about their history or where they were from, as a lot of families do. But my dad had it framed at some point. And you can see also on the edges, it's as a lot of them are unfinished. But meant a lot to my father, and a lot of how he learned about his family, and a lot of how he learned about where my grandparents came from, where my grandmother, where they came from originally. And he found that out and kind of did genealogy research on his own in the mid 1980s. And at that time, you could go into the church in Lebret, in the Capel Valley, and go into the church and go near the school. And the ledgers, the admissions and discharge records, and the large ledgers were just in large books, and you could go and flip through them, which of course is not the case now for some of those records. After the 1990s and 2000, and during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, some of those records were handed over to the TRC and some of them were not. But at the time, we searched for it, in part finding some of this beadwork and what it meant to our family, which is of course a longer story. But then how he found that photo. There's a little arrow above it, because I'm terrible at graphic design. There are computers that I made an arrow that you can barely see over the face of my great grandmother. But I sometimes if you look at residential school history, or talk about residential school history, that photo comes up quite often. Comes up in kind of image searches on Google and stuff, and has become a quote unquote relatively famous photo, because there's a similar one of the boys' class from 1907 at Capel School, and they were also made into postcards. There are several photos like that of classes of kids lined up in uniforms that were changed into postcards. That people find that very striking, not just the postcards themselves, but that those photos were made as kind of promotional items about colonialism and the celebrations of colonialism at the time. So I share those personal stories, and I also share them in a way that reflecting on the story itself, because for a long time, of course, my grandmother was very private about her time at school, and about her history and growing up. Her father had script land outside of Lestock, Saskatchewan, and my family worked on the co-op, the Métis farm in Lebret. And we learned, some of these things I learned much later in my life and weren't talked about a lot. And so for a long time, I didn't really share a lot or very much about my grandmother's time at residential school, because she herself was very private about it. But now, as I do more work with residential school survivors today, and more research and work with people who come to especially people who come to the center here at UBC, or had come to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation in Winnipeg when I was there, what kind of role intergenerational survivors have. Future generations have to tell the stories. At what point do the stories become our stories, or who tells those stories when survivors aren't able to or aren't around anymore? So it's questions like that I grapple with and share bits and pieces of it myself. This is a story, I start with a story from a Métis survivor from Fort Chip. It was included in the TRC final report, and there's a lot said about inclusion or not as much inclusion of Métis people in the TRC final report or the TRC proceedings. But this quote that you can read, I let people read it themselves instead of me reading it out. But when I read it, it rang very familiar to me, because it sounded exactly like stories my grandmother and my aunties told very often, like those very kind of day-to-day ordinary tasks they would, or what would become ordinary tasks or day-to-day tasks at residential school. Really was this kind of story was very familiar to my family and to me. Obviously there's thousands of different kinds of stories and different ways that people tell their stories. And it's also trying to find that Métis experiences were unique. Of course, the conditions at the schools, the lack of food, the rate of disease, the rate of death, forced separation from your family, loneliness and neglect. All of those broader topics of and physical and sexual abuse, of course, happen to all students in different times, in different years, in different ways. The way people share their stories is very different, but there were things that Métis people experienced that were sometimes a bit different. This story also is from my dear auntie, my friend, Rita Flamand, who I lived with and learned Michif with a long time ago. She included this story in a publication from the Aboriginal Healing Foundation about residential schools and reconciling the history of her Michif view. And it's of course, like a lot of Métis stories of residential school and a lot of First Nations and Inuit stories of residential school are kind of, they have a little bit of humor in them. And that's part of the story too, is how people tell their stories. That how people tell their stories is as much about the content of it as well, that these stories of trauma and very private, personal stories of abuse often are connected to stories, the way they tell them with humor and laughter, and that you're crying one minute and then the next minute you're kind of laughing. And so this story of kind of pagan babies, and it comes up, you know, that as I work with universities and faculty members and K-12 education and creating lesson plans and curricula and trying to revise Canadian history and try to include Métis histories and include residential school histories in a national, in a narrative about how Canada became a country, in that way that it's, because of course there's all of the Canadian histories of how Canada became a nation on old white prime ministers and a railroad and just what that means. And of course, the presence of residential schools and removal, forced removal of and dispossession and forced relocation of Métis communities, of First Nations and Inuit communities, how that shaped Canada and how that created Canada, and including that in the narrative of Canadian history. And some people, I often get questions about how to do that and the voices to do that. People are often confused by that. People are often confused about just how involved the church was. A lot of people have trouble resolving that, of how heavy-handed the Catholic and Protestant churches were in creating civilization, Christianization, and the divide between, you know, pagan, savage, and in the case of Métis, were often cast as kind of rebels and resistors. So yeah, I always remember Rita's stories. She lived along the side of Lake Winnebagosis, and it was in the middle of the summer, so I would go for a swim in the lake, and she would sit on the shore and tell me stories and laugh and make jokes. But the bench she had beside the lake was a bench she got from the old residential school. And so people, that she's telling me stories and reviving the stories at the same time in the pews that she used to sit in. All of that imagery is always with me. So some of these are, I'm going to just kind of run through some of these archival documents and writing about Métis children and attendance of Métis children. Because again, as I had my own professors and I had scholars tell me repeatedly, no, these schools, residential schools, and that was as early or late, depending on who sees 20 years ago, people saying Métis people didn't go. Métis people did not attend large residential schools. Métis people were only in day schools. But of course, that was not the case. This idea that there was a lot of concern about per capita funding and that kids would be let into schools based on a per capita attendance, or would be paid, the school would be paid based on per capita attendance. That the more kids you had meant the more money you had, which meant Catholic and Protestant churches would manipulate the numbers of kids that would attend. And often the children that would be moved around or would be manipulated would be Métis kids. And this quote, I use it often, and if anyone has read or about the history of Métis people and residential schools, this quote comes up often. But there is no more unfortunate class in the country what is to becoming outcasts and menaces to society, if not be taken to Indian schools. Be it remembered not for the mere purpose of the condition of treaties, but in the interest of the Commonwealth. There's a lot of this language in a lot of archives about residential schools, about the origins of the schools, why they were there. It's often, even today, it's trying to tie those histories to contemporary impacts of what had happened after residential school, and tie that to histories also of the day schools and Indian hospitals, tuberculosis hospitals, sanatoriums, the 60 Scoop and the child welfare system, how all of those pieces are tied together. And these ideas, because of course there's those narratives out there about altruism, and that they were trying to uplift, they were trying to help people, that they were really just trying to help people. They were trying to educate kids and Christianize them for their own good. And there's this narrative of doing good and a few bad apples, and that it was, kind of a simple binary or a simple structure, but really these larger schemes in the interest of the Commonwealth and the interests of the government, and looking at resource extraction and looking at appropriating land and stealing land from people by forcibly removing their children from their homes and forcibly removing people from their homes, especially in Métis communities, taking their homes away, taking their farms away, burning down their homes and relocating people. That, in that case is not just a story about, well, we were just educating kids, we were just trying to give them a good education. It is a bigger story than that. And that's the same, these quotes about the government and Dominion. We never said that we didn't have an obligation to half-breeds, but we recognize that possessing in a degree a title to the land and took measures to extinguish it. Very plainly stated. And trying to create a position of why they needed to take kids into residential schools or not take them. So what they did is they classed in these early documents from the early 1900s, and the documents are kind of old, and like a lot of administrative documents and policy from residential schools overall, there's a lot that were, of course, manipulated, and kind of Indian agents and RCMP and church officials and priests and nuns and teachers and lay people interpreted these rules and policies in all sorts of different ways. But this was from the Department of Indian Affairs, created these classes of Métis kids, first, second, and third class. Essentially, if you were living in quote unquote ordinary settled life of the country, if you're living essentially in non-Indigenous, a white community, then you probably don't need to go to a residential school in the eyes of the government. But those who live a quote unquote Indian mode on a road allowance, or in a Métis community, or of course the third class, this most unfortunate class of Indian women who white men are not the begetters. This quote carries on. Those of the second and third class should be taken to residential school, because like a lot of those other comments, were living like Indians, so should be taken to residential school as in the same way that the First Nations kids were being taken there. And this idea of to discourage illegitimate breeding, like a lot of rhetoric and writing and government policy at the time, church policy at the time, Protestant and Catholic, is ideas about mixing and illegitimate breeding and kind of moral uplift and all of those kind of origins of the residential school and origins of the philosophy of operating the schools, about not only assimilation and creating good Canadian citizens, but these kind of broader, insidious ideas about what they thought Canadian society should be and how they were going to extinguish people's identities and languages and societies and economies and social structures and political structures, and dismantle every part of Indigenous lives. and Métis people's lives. And Métis people, in a way that their experiences were quite different, is often they were cast as rebels, and as there were connections here to 1885, and this idea that Métis kids were rebellious and parents were rebellious, and there was correspondence about leaving, making sure kids stayed at La Brette and stayed in Capel so they weren't to move north in 1885. You'll see that's a kind of a month before Batoche. And again, even from 1885 on, that there were bigger plans, there were bigger schemes, there were bigger ideas behind the residential schools and how they were operating than a simple narrative of Christianizing and giving kids an education. And that gets caught sometimes, because there are in treaties and in agreements First Nations and Métis communities had with churches and with the government, is they wanted their kids to be educated. And of course that was a promise that was made to educate children. But like a lot of promises made to Métis and a lot of promises made to First Nations, what was promised and what came out was not the same. And so from that history, and I don't do enough of this, and that's why I wanted to, I wanted to start with survivor stories, and I often include a lot of writing about resistance and poetry, but I got nervous because I was speaking after Greg Scofield, so I didn't put a lot of poems in here. But normally I would. Normally I do. One of my professors early on in 2002, 2003, Renata Eigenbrod, I worked with her and with Laurie Barkwell, who have left us and are missed, but we would often use literature and writing, especially in Métis histories and in residential school histories, because for a lot of Canadians today who said, well, we never learned about this in school. No one ever taught us about this. I grew up in a community with a huge residential school and I had no idea what happened there. I had no idea this ever happened. I've never heard of this before. Where I often use memoirs and writing and poetry and art that talks about not just residential schools, but colonialism and histories. And the writing was always there. It was always there. And especially in survivor statements, in recordings, in songs, and there's all kinds of places that those stories were, that I try to use those voices, because it's where people felt silenced or were silenced, and people say, well, we never heard of this before. These histories were hidden. They were there. And a lot of those stories are also about the resilience and how Métis people resisted in those times. Of course, it's also not just about residential schools. It's about the child welfare system. It's about forced relocations. It's about how residential schools and day schools and hospitals were all connected to a bigger story, all of the impacts of colonialism happening at the same time. One of the quotes from the TR, not that I love quoting the TRC all the time, but it was kind of one of the mottos or taglines, and I bet it was written by someone in marketing, not to criticize, but it said for the child taken and the parent left behind. It was just a little line that they had on their promotional items, but I reiterate that one. That's what I feel that's very important, because it reflects on what was happening inside the schools, what experiences were for Métis kids, because Métis kids often felt like outsiders. They often felt, there's stories about kids that they had to take their own lunch, or they had to go to the bathroom outside, which seems like kind of a small point, but to the whole system, the fact that they were seen as kids that weren't meant to be there. They weren't meant to be in that system. They weren't meant to eat lunch with the rest of the kids. They weren't meant to go to the bathroom with the rest of the kids, because they weren't seen as part of the school. They were kind of kept separate and were treated differently. And so the way that the stories are very specific to Métis, but in the same way, there's ways of resilience and resistance and kind of responding to intergenerational impacts that is very much as much Métis specific as well. This came from the report that was released by Métis women after the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and it's about these responses to trauma and to colonialism. And I think that's trying to balance it out. I'm mindful of the time, and I just wanted to quickly reflect on kind of this reconciliation era. Like the TRC ended in 2015. It's been 5 years since the end of the TRC. And there was a lot said about Métis inclusion or non-inclusion in the TRC. And I hear that. I hear what they're saying, or inclusion in the settlement agreement. But I always try to also acknowledge the Métis survivors that did come to the TRC gatherings and who did provide statements to the TRC and who, before the TRC, part of the Legacy of Hope exhibition that I hope everyone got a chance to at least experience online if they didn't get to see it in person at the University of Alberta. The Legacy of Hope, the exhibition on Métis experiences, tells more of the story. I'm trying not to repeat a lot of those stories, that you can check it out on the Legacy of Hope website to kind of read more about how Métis experiences were. But a lot of that reflects on the response, because for the same reasons Métis felt like outsiders inside of the schools and were treated differently, and were kind of, the parents had to drop off a load of wood in the summer or in the winter to pay for their kids to go, or the kids would stay later to mop the floors or clean up to kind of pay their tuition in a way. A lot of people felt left out of the settlement agreement and felt left out of the TRC process. Students of the Isle Lacrosse School and other larger schools that were not included in the settlement agreement felt didn't represent Métis voices. And so it's, while there were voices there, it's trying to highlight some of that. And I wanted to highlight not just the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but some of the Métis specific calls to justice that came out of the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, because we're coming up on a year now since the inquiry pointed out a lot of the same things, and that was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996, and then 20 years later, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and then the inquiry. And that was part of what the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples had done, was make recommendations. And in kind of in sight of that, commissioners from the inquiry and commissioners from the TRC recognized that, yeah, recommendations were made 20 years ago, some of them almost identical. They looked at the calls to action and looked at calls to justice. We asked for this 20 years ago. We asked for this 40 years ago, and there's still, the change didn't come. So that's important. I wanted to point out some of the calls to justice that are specific to Métis people and Métis women, and violence in Métis communities, that it still exists, that it's connected to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and colonialism and residential schools, and all of what had come up through the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. And the government holds inquiries, and they hold commissions, and they create reports and calls to action. And it's really what people are asking for is change. What people are asking for is to, and there's a lot of cynicism, and there's a lot of comments about reconciliation. And this is from the Royal Commission about the relationship, the human costs. And this is what was in our head, that they examined the present cost of the present regime and the consequences. That what was asked for in 1996, and then it was asked for again. And then what's, as I include this in coursework and I include this in writing, people are like, no, you're being, please reduce your activist tone. You have to take a more neutral tone. And that often me including Métis knowledge or Indigenous oral histories or stories is seen still today as rebellious or as being activist, which I just saw as including Métis people stories in it. And I just find is a funny point where resistance and resilience and reconciliation kind of come to a crossroads, and all how it's interpreted. I've worked for several years now on conversations about settler colonial genocide and how that relates to climate change, how that relates to inequities, and the same conversation about how museums and archives hold all this knowledge and how they're telling these histories. I'm going to go through these kind of fast because I know I should have been talking about, but in the same way that there's this idea about resurgence and resilience and reconciliation, I want to talk about continuity. There's all of the stories about the buffalo coming back to parks in the West. Oh, I say West as I'm sitting practically on the ocean. I forget that I'm not in Winnipeg anymore. In the prairie provinces, my east from where I'm sitting. But that for all of the languages and the artwork and the writing that has continued throughout all of it, that some of it is a resurgence and some of it is a reconciling, but some of it is also continuity and has carried on throughout. And this is just another piece that I'll end with, writing from Rita about her idea about reconciliation. And I think for all of the comments either for or against reconciliation and the calls to action and inclusion or non-inclusion in the TRC, I think survivor voices there, the way survivors told their stories was rarely or never out of context. They often said, here's my story of my time at school, but you can't listen to my story without also listening to stories about my people and our land and our languages and the child welfare system and our health, that the stories of residential school were always framed in a much bigger context. And so looking at those calls to action, I do see where they came from, survivor stories. But I'll kind of close because I think I've probably gone a bit over too. But yeah, thank you. And I will go back to sharing my face.
Thank you very much, Tricia. So we are going to take some questions. Amanda, do we have any questions?
Not as of yet, but I do have a question actually. I'm wondering I know that you got that one photograph from your family there of all the children kind of standing in a row for the class photo. Where would one go finding those types of photos, or where are they kept now?
The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation and our center, the Residential School History and Dialogue Center, have online collections. Our collection, and I say the National Center because if you're looking for outside of British Columbia, there's more like Canada-wide at the National Center from the University of Manitoba, but also in some independent, like some provincial archives as well. Each province has their own collections that during the TRC process should have made their way to the National Center, but I've noticed that some have not. And the National Center and us as well still wait on a lot of churches to keep handing over records that were not passed over during the TRC.
I do have a question too. Like I was just wondering, like you showed some of the artwork from your grandmother. I was wondering if, as part of the archives around residential schools, if there's some artwork too that has been found, and Métis, more specifically Métis artwork, that because from one of the quotes, obviously the students the pupils were doing beading. So I'm just wondering if there's such an archive of artwork.
Of things that were done inside the schools. I think Greg's colleague and my colleague, Andrea Walsh at the University of Victoria, have worked here in British Columbia with survivors who there were art pieces, visual art paintings and drawings that were done when they were children, and they were found, and they kind of, what they did was reconnect those art pieces with survivors today of things that they did when they were kids. And there are a lot of, here in Vancouver, there's a lot of carvings. They would often have the kids kind of carving little poles and masks out of wood, and they would resell them. Where there's been beadwork, I'm not sure. I know there were embroidery and done, and that would have been connected to the large churches or the residential schools, but I'm not sure if there's been a chance for them to be reconnected with survivors or identified in that way, that they were things that were created. But that would be maybe something Greg would know more about than I would.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Just I guess a real quick follow-up to that question. And it's a great question because, I think a lot of people don't, this idea of our material art, people don't really link that to residential school or to mission schools. And I think it's important to remember that a lot of these art forms, so specifically the silk embroidery work, beadwork, a lot of these things had originally been taught in mission schools. So these were things that the Ursuline nuns in the, in the early to mid 19th century, in a lot of the mission schools that Métis girls were attending, a lot of the nuns were teaching the girls, the kind of fine art of silk embroidery and beadwork. And of course, Métis girls took that art form and they adapted it, and they made it into something, of course, which is completely unique to our culture. So where a lot of those pieces ended up, I mean, who knows? I think those are some of the pieces that are out on the open market right now. Those are probably some of the pieces that I've been able to repatriate back home. So, it's one of the things that I've always found very interesting is, I've always looked at kind of the genesis of, our art form. Where were these things being taught? Who was teaching them? Where were the materials coming from? So, it's been very kind of interesting looking at, for example, the silk work that was being done in France at the time, and how that was brought over to Canada, how that was being introduced by the nuns, and of course how young Métis girls were taking that art form and, as I said, completely readapting that art form.
Thank you. So do we have any questions from the audience?
Yep. We have a question from Tanya Harnett again, asking, do you think that the multi-volume TRC report accurately delivers / represents the Métis experience?
Sorry, could you repeat the end, the multi-volume TRC report?
Yeah, the multi-volume TRC report, does it accurately deliver or represent the Métis experience?
I think as accurately as it can, but I always, a funny story, because I like funny stories, is if you often a lot of us access the TRC final report findings online on the PDFs, and I always recommend the PDFs because the two first history volumes are massive. But if you lay them all end to end, the Métis volume, like I would always laugh. Laurie Barkwell came, he came to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation to give a talk, and him and I laughed and laughed because there's a little stack of the books near the door of all of the reports at the National Center, the final reports, and the Métis one is by far the smallest, and it sits underneath these massive histories. And then we kind of joked about how narrow it is visually and literally. So in that way, it is narrow, and it is perhaps not as thorough as the rest of it. as the rest of the whole report. And so in that way, I hear what a lot of, and I agree that a lot of, it was underrepresented. But I think while there's political and historic, and I think there's all sorts of reasons why that is the case, I also will, in support of the historians who were researching and who were writing those reports, as someone who's researched Métis experiences from archival sources and from survivors, especially for archival sources and church records, they are hard records to find. Like they are, and that's part of the Métis history of how they attended, is often their attendance was hidden. Schools would, and that was in the correspondence, is that because of the per capita, like if they had too many kids, they wouldn't count the Métis kids in there. They wouldn't count them. They would only count the First Nations kids if they had too many. But if they had too few, in order to get more kids, they would maybe bring more Métis kids around. So their attendance was often manipulated, and kids would end up, and people, survivors have those stories. They're like, well, I went to this school a couple years and then they sent me to the provincial school, but they said I was too Indian to go to that school. So they sent me to the white school and back again. So that Métis kids in this traditional jurisdictional gap, as a lot of people talk about, got shuttled back and forth. And so the records of them attending are really hard to find, because their attendance was kind of so manipulated or so kind of tossed around. As a result, their time there isn't showing up in the admissions and discharge records. So, and some of the records are hard to find, but there are reasons why that the Métis volume is much smaller.
Okay. Our next question comes from Jolie MG, and they would like you to speak more on the idea about sounding like an activist. What are some examples you can share, and how do you respond?
Yeah, I went over those quickly because it was kind of at the end there, and I was trying to be mindful of the time, because I'm mindful of the fact that we're all sitting on Zoom talks all the time now. But it was in writing about Métis histories and writing about Indigenous histories. To be honest, I had done my PhD in England, and I did so. People always ask, why would you study residential schools outside of Canada? But the origins of the schools as colonial structures, and British colonialism especially, and French colonialism, I wanted to study not just, I had the core of it being survivor statements, but also how were the origins of those schools, because they existed in Australia and the United States, in South Africa and Sweden, in Russia. They were everywhere, that they were European and origins of the schools and the churches. And in doing so, my narratives of including Métis philosophers and writers, and the stories of our survivors and elders, and the way I would use oral histories would sometimes come to question in an academic setting, as they always do, and that it was perceived as activism writing rather than scholarly writing. And so the note often would come from an editor who said, please reduce your activist tone, which for me was really just, I would, under a different title, would call it Indigenous knowledge or Métis history, but in a different setting was called activism. So it was just me trying to push back against that, which I think is a conversation that comes up all the time in trying to include Métis or Michif methodologies in kind of Western academic settings, that sometimes is welcomed and sometimes receives a little bit of resistance.
The next question is from Julie Mooney, who asks, could you speak more about the tension between resilience, resistance, and reconciliation? How can Métis participate in reconciliation without resisting and being resilient? Or how can we explain reconciliation to include resistance?
Yeah, and that was another part that I did quickly, and I apologize for going over those parts so quickly. But it was often, now we're kind of in this post-TRC time, that the TRC, it ended in 2015 and now it's 2020 all of a sudden. And so 5 years have passed. And so there's a lot of reflection on what does reconciliation mean? And what do the calls to action mean? And are they effective? And is anybody doing anything? Is the government doing anything? And what does that mean for Métis communities, especially who really felt left out of the TRC process? What does it mean moving forward? And so those terms, reconciliation and resistance and resilience, come up quite often, and people often ask how they're being defined, especially reconciliation. People often ask, what is a kind of a Métis definition for reconciliation? And I think there is no one definition. It's often government. To be fair, it's often government folks who work for government, provincial and federal government, who ask. They kind of want one sentence, or they kind of want one answer, and unfortunately, that doesn't exist. It does become very individual, and there's a lot of people who won't use the term at all, who prefer the term resistance and who prefer a term resurgence in place of reconciliation, because they don't want to use that term. But then there's a lot of folks who work, especially with survivors, or work with kind of a broader scope of transitional justice or of change, and who really are still proponents of reconciliation. It becomes in some ways divisive, but then people try to reclaim terms or use a term that's better suited to how they think, especially Métis communities, would respond to this kind of post-TRC era.
And the next question is from Andrea Burkhart, and she would like you to talk about the third class that you described by residential schools, if you could describe that a little bit more.
Yeah, the third class, and I'll read it off my, those who form the most unfortunate class in the community are the illegitimate offspring of Indian women and who white men are not the begetters. Which as we read kind of archival documents and writing, especially from priests from that time period, I think they refer there to both Indian women, First Nations women, who would have had kids with either, from their perception, either white men, half-breed men, or men they felt wouldn't, I guess, single mothers at the time. It's kind of, you can see the language about this illegitimate, the terms illegitimate come up, and that I think that comes up often in Métis writing and Métis histories overall, these ideas about mixing and illegitimacy, and come up in kind of either a religious context or in a government context of kind of ideas about blood, or mixing in a very kind of derogatory, not misunderstood is kind of an understatement, but the third class was, that first class being people who lived in a non-Indigenous community, or living in a white community for their perception. They didn't need to be taken to residential school, but people who were living an Indian mode of life or perceived that way would be taken to residential school. And then there was this third class of illegitimate children that were perceived. There's a lot of documents that come from departments of health, especially in the province of Saskatchewan and Manitoba. The Department of Health had a lot of moral questions, questions of morality and community morality and cleanliness came up quite often, that described community members, Métis community members and Métis communities in a way that was, we need to send them to residential schools so they don't mix with the non-Indigenous population. essentially. This very kind of broadly racist, systemic racist kind of correspondence that came up too often.
All right, and our last question is from Karen Ball, who asks, what kind of reparative work, if any, has the Catholic Church engaged in? Has anyone recorded interviews with clergy who were employed at residential schools?
There were a few. There were a few teachers and people who were hired by the church that did give statements to the TRC and that do work today, Protestant and Catholic. Traditionally, the Catholic Church has been much slower, or in some cases at a standstill, where the United Church, the Anglican Church have made apologies and have their own reconciliation programs that were from the early 1990s, to be honest. And the Catholic Church has faced court cases compelling them to hand over archival documents, which they were not willing to hand over at some points in time. There's still there was a statement of regret that was released from the Pope, but there is still a lot of pressure from survivor communities today for the Vatican or for the Pope to create or to pressure them to have an apology rather than a statement of regret, and keep pressuring for more acknowledgement. And there's been lots of media reports too about, and writing, journalistic style writing about the church's role and their unwillingness to kind of connect work at the Vatican and that level of the Catholic Church having any knowledge of the residential schools, saying that was something that happened in Canada, it's not our business, which of course is not true. But there are members of clergy, and there are churches. There are in churches, and especially I have spoken often with new theological scholars and people who are training to be nuns today, who want to include residential school history in the teaching that they do today. So there are in different regions of Catholic Church in Canada that are interested in including residential school history in what they teach to new sisters and brothers in their churches. Not all, but some, yeah.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tricia. I do have a question for you, the last one. I was just wondering, where do you see Métis residential school research going from where you are right now? So what are the avenues or the possibilities for the future?
So I think in line with other stories is maybe what I was talking about before too, is when we work here with the Indian Residential School Survivor Society and all survivors who are around to tell those stories, is about the residential schools, but it's now that there's a settlement for day schools and there's more research being done on Indian hospitals and tuberculosis hospitals and sanatorium, is trying to open up that view. There was, because during the TRC, it was limited. It was limited. The TRC and the commission was limited by what they could research and what they could talk about by the list of the schedule of official schools. But now in post-TRC, it's open to conversations about the 60 Scoop, about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and a broader conversation about colonialism, and which also includes, of course, how that affected Métis families in all of those aspects of Indian hospitals and day schools and schools that were not included in the original TRC and the settlement agreement. So as that opens up, as this bigger history opens up about colonialism broadly, I think it includes more Métis stories.
Okay, thank you very much. So that's it for today. Thank you. I want to thank you, both of you, Gregory and Tricia, for your generosity and sharing your stories. The stories, you know, like of material culture coming home, or stories of Métis residential school, in some ways like of the children who went to residential schools and coming home at the same time. So thank you again very much. And I was watching at the same time, you know, what was going on Facebook, and I see that people are appreciating the stories that you shared. So thank you also to the audience and to the questions, the wonderful questions that were shared. And thank you to everybody ultimately, because that was a first experience of doing MÉTISTalks online. And I think it was extremely successful. So at one point I saw that there was around 90 people that were actually listening today. So I think this is fantastic, and there's going to be more people watching the video when we put the video online on Facebook, but also on our website. So thank you all. And if you want to see the Legacy of Hope virtual exhibit, it can be found on legacyofhope.ca, and also the Forgotten exhibit on Métis residential school experiences is online at forgottenmétis.ca. So until next time, stay well, be well and stay safe. So thank you very much again. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.